The casualties thing is actually, when I was listening to your results about the interviews, was very interesting to me, because one of the things that comes out statistically from these results is that this sort of a martyr effect. You know, this many of our soldiers died, and as a result, that's the sort of, we will never get back to you because of the blood, etc., that has been way lost on this and stuff. It turns out that, statistically speaking, that sort of effect sometimes tends to be dramatized, basically, and it's almost becomes one in which, if the state wants to use that discourse, or if the leadership wants to use that discourse, it has a lot of opportunity to do so. But it's not always automatic that the casualties are going to be decisive, the past wars casualties, and how things move forward or not. You know, one story here to give here is, you know, Hitler is often mentioned as to when he won the elections, that he was able to count a lot on the World War I veterans in Germany, and how these individuals, feeling very much ignored, were migrated very easily to the side of Hitler when he came around. What is forgotten, though, is in that immediate post-World War I situation, one of the biggest civil society organizations in Germany, which had the biggest amount of membership of these war veterans, was an entirely non-violent movement, basically. And that should make us understand about the sort of effects of past soldiers, past martyrs. These things are not guaranteed on how they're going to go. There is a lot of movements that it could take for us. You know, in the break I was talking to Haleanum from Dosh about this leadership issue. In international relations, we talk a lot about leadership, yet we have limited studies on what really happens or what really is, what we know about it. One of the interesting things that I saw in some side projects that I did on this is that, you know, leaders do seem to care about what happened to the last leaders, and that can affect whether they choose some paths versus other paths. We learn from our mistakes, not necessarily always from our successes, and that sort of thing came out from this study as well, that at the very lowest levels of peace, they were looking as to what happened to my predecessors in that war. Did they face exile, or, depending on the situation, much worse than that? So this sort of material should also be important for us. Third parties, and you know, here we get to that realist liberal discussion that Nimetanım you know, did to us very interestingly about this. You know, where can we place the various dimensions? And IGOs, major powers, and we tend to maybe too easily in international relations put IGOs in the liberal camp, and or various forms of liberal schools, and major powers under realism. And then we end up arguing that this should be mattering at some level and the other at the other level. One of the interesting things that comes out of this is that IGOs can play a very interesting role at the very early stages of this. That sort of joint membership of this thing. You know, let's not forget that at a very low level of peace, you might not even have something as basic as an ambassador in each other's countries. But having that sort of opportunity to communicate is given to us through IGOs, and that can help us to find maybe other ways of cooperation areas and so on that can lead us to perhaps facilitate communication, reduce uncertainty. Major powers, on the other hand, have played, in some of the research that I did, a role in moving you to a higher level of peace, basically. That sort of pushing, cajoling that they can engage in. Mediation activities, unfortunately, much of this work that I've done so far hasn't found their mediation activities to play a very crucial role, but that's the one that I need to do much more work with, so that's much more limited. And what we should not forget that when you are an IGO mediator and going into one of these tough cases, it's clearly a very difficult situation for you, and the same is true for a major power. If it was that easy, they would have resolved it. They need that help, and that might again be slowing them down. International norms, if you think about it, statistically, I didn't find much support for. But case study is interesting. And if you think about Russian-Turkish relations, would that slight improvement in relations that we saw in the 1960s have been able to come out between Russia and Turkey if it had not been for that global environment of détente period? I think is interesting for us to think about. So these international norms, basically, and especially if you have a more major and a more minor power, there might be some interesting ways that they're influenced. But I think that up to now, I haven't looked enough at this more regional norms and how they might be influencing things, and that's something that, as such, I think there's a lot that I could do there. I'm going to go a little bit quicker over these. democracy, of course, those of you who are familiar with IR, there's a lot that's said about democracy. Democracy supposedly reduces violence between countries. What I end up finding is that democracy actually, at the very lowest levels of peace, actually makes it even harder to improve your relations. That sort of accountability in domestic politics, that sort of worry that if I make a very courageous move, I might then find that that I lose elections. There's maybe a little bit too many worries about this. It might be myths, but unfortunately, at the lowest level of peace, basically, that democracy feature is not helpful. That is something that goes against perhaps the IR literature's general belief that democracy matters, but it's something that, on the other hand, we should not forget that for the reaching of the highest levels of peace, having democracy on both sides certainly matters. There are very few instances in which, if you're both democracies, you actually stay at that medium level of peace, basically, unless the other forces are, unless there's a issue of quality of democracy and so on. But if you think about it, not only do we have, of course, a very dramatic, clear-cut example from this forum, basically, of despite both their problems, the democracy level in Turkey, the democracy level on the island of Cyprus, yet where is that great force pushing us forward? We don't see that, basically. So democracy has that sort of element we should not forget. Only it's not also just about us. Argentina, United Kingdom come up another example of this, where Krishna has been making some very interesting statements about the Malvinas or Falklands, basically. And again, we have to think about, is democracy always going to be a force for pushing us? Relative power and turns out to be not as influential as we tend to think about it in these discussions. Of course, if you have interest similarity, it's certainly good, I find. Economy tends to be problematic in some ways because good economic data is, for both sides, is problematic. There is, I think, too much guesswork that goes on, and trade data is what I'm really interested in there, and that's a lot of missing value. So again, yes, trade probably helps, but I actually think that comes out usually after you reach that high level of peace rather than the reverse, but again, it might be useful. Recent conflict has a learning experience as well, I find. Now, I think I have actually gone a little bit over what I was planning to, so I'm going to wrap up quickly. Where does revenge come in all of this? I find that, yes, there is something to be said about revenge, and we do care, there are studies about how revenge is important for us, and how some people have described it as one of the most basic instincts that we have out there, that need to get vengeance, that need to retaliate in some way to show reciprocity. But on the other hand, we should not forget that some of that is really geared at the individual level. And we are now talking here about the state level, at least in the study that I'm engaging in. And is that so much automatic that you will be engaging in revenge, basically? And if you think about French-German relations, which used to be discussed as this very vengeful relationship, and there you could find some very, these famous French authors talking about how they would die for getting back Alsace-Lorraine and so stuff of that kind. You would also find many of them actually saying they really, couldn't care at all in that same period whether they got that territory back or not. So this, looking back, we can find lots of examples of revenge on a selective basis, and they do exist. But the last war doesn't automatically mean that what happened there, that you're automatically geared to going back to war time after time. In fact, some of the things that work within that revenge feeling, with a little bit of movement, you can actually help them. They can actually be a force for improvement of relations as well. So revenge by itself, I don't find is, yes, certainly important, but actually doesn't, and certainly much more research is done on it. It needs to be done on it, particularly within international relations, but some of it might be too easily stated without not empirical evidence shown for how it's working for us, but clearly much more needs to be done there. I already went over settlements. Third parties was again pointed out in the case of Cyprus, and how they might at times be necessary for how they become involved. What I haven't talked to you too much about is this issue of internal peace. A lot of the stable peace literature tends to be focused entirely on country to country or an entire region. So if you think about Karl Deutsch and others, this pluralistic security community discussion, we really are getting at the regional level basically. But what about the internal peace basically? What about, within an organized region? What about within a society, a country? And there we clearly need to be engaging much more into this stuff. There we end up focusing maybe a little bit too much on taking it for granted and ignoring other dimensions. So there's, in my view, this effect of international peace on bilateral state relations has a lot to teach us basically, and a lot to show how it might be playing a role, and that's some of the things that I'm getting into in newer research. Where does leadership stand? I mean, you can certainly think about this clear-cut importance for us on how these various features, on the martyrs, the casualties, the importance of territory, lack of importance of territory, leadership has a lot to tell us, and so it becomes crucial for us on how leadership sees this. So that sort of differentiation of what is public opinion of general society versus the elites, seeing that sort of differences, I think, is quite revealing. And how do we work with leadership then becomes, I think, a very fundamental issue. And perhaps, these sorts of workshops that are going to be designed in the next couple of days, that's going to be implemented the next day, has a lot to show to us. I'm going to conclude here and open the floor to any questions and comments that you might have. Thank you.